They told Elvis to keep his mouth shut, but that night, he stepped on stage, took a breath, and shattered silence with just 4 words that changed everything. It was the summer of 1956, and Elvis Presley was already a name that could stir the air of any room he walked into. Flashbulbs popped, screams erupted, record players spun his voice in thousands of homes. But behind the stage curtains and polished shoes, a storm had begun to brew, one that not even the king could control. And it all started with 4 simple words. But we're not there yet. On a sticky, hot July evening in Memphis, Elvis stood backstage at the Ellis Auditorium. The crowd outside throbbed like a living thing, buzzing with anticipation. But Elvis wasn't smiling. He wasn't even humming like he usually did. He sat quietly in his dressing room, staring at a worn-out letter clutched in his hands. A letter that had just been delivered by a trembling studio assistant. The letter was brief, cold, and direct. It came from the top, an executive from his record label, RCA, and it said one thing very clearly: keep your mouth shut, no politics, no opinions, just sing. Elvis read it again and again. Keep your mouth shut. Was that all he was now? A puppet with a pompadour and a microphone. A boy from Tupelo who could sing but wasn't allowed to feel. Didn't they know what it was like growing up with nothing? With his mama crying into her apron, with neighbors looking down on them because they couldn't afford proper shoes. This wasn't the first time someone tried to silence him. A few weeks earlier, during a late-night rehearsal, Elvis had spoken up. He made a quiet remark about the way a black gospel singer was being treated by studio staff. "That ain't right," he'd said, loud enough for the wrong ears to hear. And now, this letter. A warning, a leash. He looked into the mirror and saw not a rebel, but a man cornered by fame. But then his jaw clenched. He stood up, and with a calmness that belied the fire inside, he tore the letter in half. The crowd was already chanting his name, Elvis, Elvis. The walls vibrated with the roar of teenagers and mothers and fathers who had never seen anything like him. He walked down the hallway, past the guards, past the reporters trying to catch a glimpse. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, was there, sweating bullets and waving his hands. "Stick to the script, boy," Parker hissed. "We don't need trouble." Elvis didn't answer. Not yet. The lights dimmed. The curtain began to rise. The band struck the opening chord of Heartbreak Hotel. But Elvis didn't step to the mic, not right away. Instead, he looked straight into the crowd, into the eyes of thousands who didn't know they were about to witness a moment that would never make it to the newsreels. He took a breath. And with a slow, deliberate voice that cut through the music, Elvis said just 4 words: "I ain't your puppet." The crowd froze, the band stopped playing, and for a few seconds, the world held its breath. Those 4 words would echo far beyond the walls of that auditorium. They would ripple through the music industry, the media, and even politics. That night, Elvis didn't just sing, he stood up. And the cost of that defiance, well, that's where the real story begins. That's rare, real rare. That night, Elvis walked out into the Memphis dusk, pacing the wide lawns of Graceland under a sky of lavender and gold. The scent of magnolia trees hung in the air, and distant crickets hummed like an old blues rhythm. He found himself thinking about the early days, those hungry nights in Tupelo, when his mama would hum hymns to help him sleep, when his daddy scraped together change for guitar strings, when the dream was simple: sing from the soul and hope someone listens. Somewhere along the way, the lights had gotten too bright. The costumes too heavy, the schedule too packed, and the songs, though still beautiful, had started to feel like routines, not revelations. But now, this stranger's words echoed louder than applause. "You made me feel seen." The next morning, Elvis picked up the phone and asked his assistant to track the letter's origin. No return address. The assistant reminded him, "We might not find her." "Try," Elvis said, "please." Days passed, the search continued. No leads, no name, nothing in the usual fan mail records. It was like she had appeared only to deliver a message, then vanished. Still, something in Elvis refused to let go. He began carrying a small notebook, jotting thoughts, phrases, lyrics. At night, he sat at the piano again, not rehearsing hits, but searching for truth. For the first time in years, Elvis was writing, not for Urka, not for a show, for himself, and maybe, just maybe, for her. He didn't know her face or her name, but she had opened a door he thought was forever closed. And though she was still a stranger, she had become his. Elvis knew that if he couldn't find her, he could at least honor her. And honoring someone meant more than a song or a speech. It meant truth, even if that truth was uncomfortable. So he did the one thing he hadn't done in years. He opened up. The next concert was in Charlotte, North Carolina. The arena was packed, lights blazing, the band tuning up behind the curtain. Fans cheered and screamed his name like they always did, but backstage, Elvis wasn't pacing with pre-show adrenaline. He was quiet, calm, focused. In his dressing room, he stared at the mirror, adjusting the collar of his white jumpsuit. The gold embroidery sparkled under the vanity lights, but he barely noticed. He reached into his pocket and touched the folded letter, creased now from too many readings. Joe peeked in and asked, "You good?" In that Elvis nodded. "Tonight's different." Joe paused. "Different how? I'm not here to perform tonight," Elvis said. "I'm here to speak." When he walked onto the stage, the crowd erupted. He gave them the smile, the wave, the familiar opening strum of CZ Rider. But as the music faded, he did something unexpected. He stepped up to the mic and said, "Before we go on tonight, I want to tell you a story." A hush fell over the arena. Thousands of fans leaned in. "A few weeks ago," Elvis began, "I received a letter. It wasn't signed. No return address, just words, beautiful aching words. A woman wrote to me, not asking for a thing, not praising me like a star, but speaking to me like a human being. She said something I'll never forget. You made me feel seen when no one else did. The audience was silent." Elvis continued, voice steady but tender. "I don't know who she is or where she is, but I've read her words every day since, and they reminded me of why I started doing this in the first place. Not for the lights or the fame, but for connection, for moments like this." A wave of emotion rippled through the crowd. Grown men wiped their eyes. Teenagers clutched their hearts. Mothers pulled their children close. Elvis smiled just slightly. "So tonight, I'm going to do something I haven't done in a while. I'm going to sing not as Elvis the icon, but as Elvis the man, the son of Gladys, the kid from Tupelo. And maybe, just maybe, that woman's out there listening, and if she is, I want her to know she changed something in me." He looked down at the piano, signaled the band, and began to play a soft, stripped-down version of Love Me Tender. No spotlight tricks, no pyrotechnics, just music, raw and real. His voice cracked once. The crowd didn't mind. In fact, they loved him more for it. Because in that moment, he wasn't unreachable. He was one of them, and in the audience, someone, a stranger or a soulmate, felt more seen than ever before. That night, something shifted, not in the charts or the headlines, but in the soul of a man who had carried too many expectations for too long. And in the echo of every note, there was a quiet promise. This wasn't the end. It was a return to something pure, something human. He stood in the narrow corridor of the dressing room, gripping the edge of the sink, staring into the mirror as if hoping it would give him some kind of answer. Outside, the crowd was alive, electric, roaring with anticipation. Yet all he could hear was the echo of 4 words still ringing in his ears. "Don't say a word." That had been the warning. Not a suggestion, a command, given with tight jaws and colder eyes. But Elvis Presley wasn't built for silence, not the kind they wanted. Not the kind that smothered truth beneath layers of PR smiles and well-rehearsed gestures. His heart was thumping like a rebel drum, not from nerves, but from resistance. He remembered yesterday how that call came in, abrupt and clipped, from a man he'd never met, who spoke as though he owned the right to filter Elvis's soul. "Stick to the script," the voice had said, "or everything you've worked for could vanish." And then came the deal. Play nice, say nothing, and they'd greenlight the gospel album he'd long dreamed of. But beneath all that glittered promise, he sensed a threat, something darker, something they weren't saying. It wasn't just about songs, it was about silencing the man who dared to speak outside their narrative. The room smelled faintly of cologne, dust, and an old tension that had been building for years. The jacket he wore tonight was custom, made, the kind of thing designed to distract the cameras from what really mattered. But he wasn't thinking about fashion. He was thinking about a memory, one that had come rushing back moments ago. The night his mother once told him, "Son, your voice was given to you for more than music. Use it to lift, not just to entertain." That sentence hit him harder tonight than ever before. He wiped the sweat from his brow and looked at the door. On the other side stood the machine, networks, executives, handlers all waiting to see if the puppet would dance. But Elvis wasn't a puppet, not tonight, not anymore. He turned, picked up a piece of paper from the vanity table, a letter. No return address, just a few words written in a shaky hand. "We believe in you, even if they don't." That line felt like a lifeline. His lungs filled with resolve. He could feel it now. This wasn't about risk. It was about reclaiming who he truly was. The knock came on the door. Showtime. He stepped out, eyes steady, spine unshaken. The hallway stretched ahead like a tunnel to something irreversible. As he walked, the voices faded, the lights dimmed, and in that quiet, his heart whispered back to the world, louder than ever before, "I was born to speak." But he hadn't yet. Not just yet. That moment was coming, and when it did, it would shake not just the stage, but the very walls of the system that tried to mute him. He stepped out of the corridor and into the light, but nothing felt illuminating. The air was heavy, not with silence. No, the crowd outside was roaring, but with something much more suffocating. Expectation. It clawed at his throat, dug into his skin like invisible fingers of control. They had warned him, just smile. Just nod. And whatever happens, don't speak a word. But he was Elvis Presley, not a puppet stitched together by contracts and committee meetings. That morning, his coffee had gone cold as Colonel Tom Parker paced back and forth, repeating the same 4 words. Not a single word. They feared what his voice could do, not in song, but in truth. Because Elvis didn't just sing, he exposed. He peeled back the varnish from America's illusions. And tonight, in this hotel ballroom lined with executives and masked intentions, he felt the weight of their fear. He remembered the letter. A torn piece of paper from a stranger in Georgia, folded a dozen times with a single question scribbled in blue ink. If they can silence you, who else will they silence next? That line haunted him. It echoed through his mind louder than any crowd ever had. He looked in the mirror before stepping out. Gone was the rebel in leather, replaced by a man in a crisp suit that didn't feel like his own. But the fire in his eyes hadn't dimmed. Not yet, a producer whispered from behind the curtain. They'll cancel the tour if you speak. Another said, your mother's name. Do you want it dragged through the headlines? And someone else hissed, they'll make you out to be unstable. Dangerous. That word again. Dangerous. To speak was dangerous. To stay silent was betrayal. He took a deep breath. The applause began. And 100 flashbulbs exploded like electric confetti. He walked up to the podium. The cue card was right there, printed in bold letters, thank you, God bless, no questions. He placed his hands on either side of the mic. Every heartbeat felt like a hammer against a locked door. And in that moment, everything paused. The stage lights flickered slightly. The crowd leaned forward. Somewhere, a woman clutched her pearls. Somewhere else, a journalist uncapped their pen. And Elvis, looking straight into the cameras, finally opened his mouth and began to speak. Elvis sat, frozen in the dark corridor backstage, the muffled roar of the audience echoing through the walls like a faraway thunder. He should have felt pride, even glory, after what just happened on that stage, but instead, his heart beat like a drum in a funeral march. He hadn't just sung a song. He had thrown a challenge into the face of power itself when he whispered those 4 words into the microphone. I ain't staying. Silent, it was as if he had ripped a curtain open that everyone had long pretended wasn't there. The colonel hadn't said a word since, but his eyes had. Cold, calculating, threatening. The kind of silence that screamed louder than any argument. Elvis could feel it in his bones, the kind of feeling that told you you'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Just then, the door creaked open. It wasn't the colonel. It was June, his backup singer, the only one brave enough to speak to him after the storm. They're talking about canceling the next 2 shows. Elvis, she said in a whisper, they're saying you broke contract, that you disobeyed direct orders. Elvis stared ahead, hands trembling, his jaw clenched. I didn't disobey anything, he muttered. I told the truth, and that's what burned them. The truth. He wasn't supposed to speak about the threats he'd received, about the letters warning him to stay out of politics, about the warnings painted on his car windshield in red. Silence is safety. But when the moment came, he couldn't hold it in. The words spilled out like fire from a broken dam. Flashbacks raced through his mind. His mother telling him, son, your voice is God's gift. Don't ever let fear silence it. The colonel didn't believe in that kind of truth. To him, the stage was a weapon for money, not a platform for meaning. But Elvis was done playing puppet. He stood up, walked past June, and out the back door into the pouring rain, as if the storm outside mirrored the war inside him. The paparazzi had already caught wind of the story. Flashbulbs lit up the alley like lightning. Questions were shouted. Elvis, are you being silenced? Is this the end of your career? He didn't answer. Not yet. There was too much at stake. Not just money or fame, but soul. And for the first time, he realized that silence was no longer safe. That silence was the real enemy. Back in the hotel room, his phone rang non-stop. Studio heads, lawyers, networks, all of them panicking, all of them asking him to take it back. But he wouldn't, because somewhere, in some small town, there was a kid listening, watching, hoping someone would speak up. And if Elvis stayed silent now, he'd be teaching that kid to do the same. He couldn't live with that. Not anymore. They said he'd be finished, done for, blacklisted from the stage he once ruled. But Elvis just stood still, watching the headlines scream louder than ever before. Elvis defies the order, they read, as if rebellion was the only thing he'd ever known. The backlash came faster than the cheers. Radio silence on some stations, whispers in back rooms, deals quietly falling through. But when a reporter finally asked him off camera, was it worth it? Elvis didn't blink. He looked the man dead in the eye and said, "If I had stayed silent, I wouldn't be Elvis." And just like that, the fire returned to his eyes. They tried to bury him in shame, but he rose, louder, prouder, and more determined. Colonel Parker panicked. Sponsors pulled away. Studios grew cold. Even some fans, confused and caught in the storm, hesitated. Yet every time they told Elvis to fix it, to apologize, to kneel, he simply shook his head. "I ain't made for crawling," he muttered one night backstage, strumming his guitar like it was his only shield. And when he walked out that evening in Las Vegas, the curtains trembling behind him, no one knew if the crowd would cheer or turn away, but they cheered. Oh, they roared like the roof would crack, because people didn't just come for a song, they came for the man who refused to be broken. One of his bandmates later said, "That night it was like he wasn't singing just for the stage. He was singing to prove he was still alive. Every lyric became a protest. Every strum became a declaration." And the 4 words he had whispered into a storm that night, "I won't stay quiet," echoed louder than any anthem. But it wasn't easy. The nights were longer, the calls fewer, the cameras more invasive, and behind the spotlight, a man wrestled with doubt. Did I do the right thing? He asked once, alone in Graceland's quiet halls. But even in doubt, he stood tall, because Elvis knew this wasn't just about music. It was about truth, about voice, about what it meant to stand when standing meant falling. He recorded new tracks with more grit, more soul, more truth than ever. The rawness in his voice, once polished for the masses, now scratched with meaning. "This is who I am," he told his producer, pressing his palms against the glass booth. And in a world that tried to silence him, he sang louder, not for fame, not for redemption, but for the fire inside that refused to die. And fans, real ones, felt it. They knew they weren't just hearing a legend, they were witnessing a revolution. In one of his final interviews that year, a young journalist asked what he wanted to be remembered for. Elvis smiled, leaned back, and said, "For the moment I didn't shut up." And as the tape clicked off, the room fell silent, because in that silence, his voice still echoed, unbroken, unforgettable, and undefeated. He didn't march, he didn't tweet, he sang, because that was his voice. In one performance, a stripped-down, candlelit rendition of an old gospel, he paused midway, eyes closed, and whispered into the mic, "I won't stay quiet, and neither should you." The crowd froze, then erupted. One fan called it a sermon wrapped in soul. Another said he healed us with a whisper. And still, behind closed doors, Elvis wondered, what now? Was this his final chapter? Or just the beginning of something bigger than music? He began writing again. Not just songs, but thoughts, notes, letters, sentences scrawled on napkins. "What good is a voice," he wrote once, "if you only use it when it's safe?" Slowly, people from all walks of life started owning the phrase. Women's marches, teachers' unions, underground jazz clubs, civil rights speeches. From hushed cafes in New Orleans to smoky rooftops in New York, it echoed like a heartbeat. "I won't stay quiet." One day his manager asked, "Do you realize what you've done?" Elvis just smiled, strummed his guitar, and said, "All I did was tell the truth." The rest was already burning. Because truth, real truth, doesn't need an amplifier. It needs a soul brave enough to sing. And Elvis had become that soul. Not the boy from Tupelo, not the king of rock, but the man who chose not to be silenced, even when silence was safer. In the end, it wasn't a chart-topping hit or a rhinestone jumpsuit or a sold-out tour that marked his legacy. It was 4 simple words whispered into a storm, heard by a world ready to roar. "I won't stay quiet." It started as a whisper. Those 4 words tucked behind a storm of headlines, buried under scandal and controversy. "I won't stay quiet." At first, they were just defiance, an echo of a man refusing to bow. But as the weeks rolled on, those words began to move. A student in Chicago wrote them across her notebook. A jazz singer in Harlem painted them onto her dressing room mirror. A soldier overseas scribbled them on his helmet. It wasn't just about Elvis anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been told to sit down, shut up, and play nice. Radio stations that once Silenced Him suddenly found themselves flooded with requests. Play the one where he stands up. Protest signs appeared. Not about war, not about politics, but about voice, about truth. I won't stay quiet. The phrase became more than a quote. It became a banner. At first, Elvis didn't even realize what he'd started. They're just words, he told a friend. But then he got the letters, thousands of them. A nurse wrote, "Because of you, I spoke up against my boss." A young boy said, "I told my father I want to dance. He called me a fool, but I won't stay quiet." And Elvis, this man who once doubted his own strength, found something new in those letters, purpose. "I never meant to be a leader," he whispered one evening, pacing his porch in Graceland, the letters clutched in his hand. But maybe the world needed to hear someone say it first. His team wanted to monetize it, put the phrase on t-shirts, mugs, posters. But Elvis refused. "It ain't for sale," he snapped. "This ain't no slogan, it's a soul." Soon, news anchors were quoting it. Writers began using it in headlines. Celebrities, some, once silent, themselves echoed the line during award speeches, interviews, social posts. One late-night host even joked, "If Elvis Presley's got the guts to speak, maybe Congress should take notes." But amidst the noise, Elvis remained grounded. He didn't parade around as a revolutionary. Elvis stepped into the night air, the roar of the crowd fading behind him like a dying storm. But inside his chest, a new fire had just been lit. He had said it. Those 4 words, boldly, fearlessly, and now the walls that had caged him for so long were beginning to crack. The corridor backstage was a blur of panicked staff, security radios buzzing, angry voices clashing with confused ones, but Elvis walked straight through them like a man reborn. Outside, a black car waited, engine running, headlights slicing through the dark like twin eyes watching history unfold. His manager rushed behind him, shouting threats, warnings, consequences. But Elvis didn't even turn his head. He opened the door, slid in, and as the car pulled away from the stadium, he leaned back with a deep exhale, the kind that doesn't just come from lungs, but from a soul that's been suffocating for years. The city lights blinked past the windows, but Elvis wasn't looking at them. His eyes were fixed on a folded letter he had carried in his pocket for weeks, the last one from the girl who had sparked it all. The one who had written, "You gave me a voice when I had none. Don't let them take yours." He opened it slowly, fingertips trembling, not from fear, but from something far more rare in his world, clarity. This wasn't just rebellion, this was redemption. By morning, headlines would explode. Elvis defies orders, Presley off script. 4 words that shook the stage. There would be meetings, lawsuits, sponsors pulling out, TV stations demanding apologies, but Elvis didn't care. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of losing something. He was proud of what he had reclaimed. The next day, when he walked into the studio for an interview, the room was packed with press. Cameras clicked. Reporters leaned in. The producer whispered, "Please stick to the script." But Elvis took the seat, looked directly into the lens, and said, "Let's talk truth." No fluff, no PR spin, just the raw, unapologetic man behind the legend. He spoke about control, about image, about the price of fame and the cost of silence. And when they tried to cut to commercial, he raised his voice, not in anger, but in insistence. This was the Elvis people weren't used to, but it was the Elvis they needed. Later that week, letters began pouring in, not just from fans, but from people who felt seen, heard, inspired. That girl, the one who wrote him first, she sent one final note. It said, "You remembered who you are. And in doing that, you reminded me who I am too." Elvis held that letter for a long time, standing in front of the mirror, not as an icon, not as a king, but simply as a man who finally reclaimed his voice. And as he walked out to the next stage, lights blinding, crowd roaring, he smiled, not because they cheered, but because this time he wasn't singing their script. He was singing his truth.